So the first thing I'm going to do.
Oh, it's way, way back. 23A, guys, in the homework.
I see. Thank you.
What page is the supplement?
What was that?
The supplements were a file.
There's like an online. Oh.
Um,
22A.
Read a tweet using or less to
Page
describe
for that?
yourself. I am a lot like a 90s teen drama, charming, sassy,
thing about?
humorous, and while somewhat dramatic, you can't help but stick it out until the end.
you're in.
Wow, that's awesome.
I'd accept you.
Oh, thank you.
Are you gonna do a video?
No.
Okay, so I'm just going to focus on this picture for right now. And then once I teach using this picture, then we'll actually start tackling some of the problems in the homework packet.
Awesome.
The sympathetic and parasympathetic division, they have a lot of similarities and they have differences. One very good similarity that they both utilize is this 2-neuron chain. At the end of the 2-neuron chain, they both target involuntary effectors. On that drawing that says ANS drawings, here are the explanations for the drawings I have. An involuntary effector is the heart. An involuntary effector can be glands. So that's my picture for a gland because many of them are coiled. An involuntary effector is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is spindle-shaped and it is mononucleated. And then another involuntary effector is an adipocyte, which it looks like it's a diamond ring almost, where it's filled with a lot of adipose, or a lot of fat, and the nucleus is kind of pushed out to the periphery. So that's the explanation for my drawings. Again, they both use a 2-neuron chain, and they target involuntary effectors. Okay. Another way that they are similar is that the first neuron releases acetylcholine. That is not the first time you've heard of that neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released from a somatic motor neuron onto skeletal muscle. These are not somatic motor neurons. A week ago, we had a little chalkboard talk where I said, if I say somatic, you say skeletal or conscious control, awareness of. If I say visceral, you say not aware, involuntary. Okay. So these 2 neurons are visceral. You have no control over when these fire, and you're certainly not having control over these effectors. The first neuron is called the preganglionic neuron. The second neuron is called the postganglionic neuron. Those are different terms than presynaptic and postsynaptic. Presynaptic simply means it's an upstream neuron. Postsynaptic means it's the downstream. The preganglionic neuron is presynaptic to the postganglionic neuron. True? The postganglionic neuron is presynaptic to the involuntary effectors. Are you seeing that? So presynaptic, postsynaptic, those are relative terms. They are simply describing what's upstream versus downstream. But preganglionic and postganglionic narrows down the information for us. Preganglionic, postganglionic, boom, right away, I know I'm talking about a 2-neuron chain. That's part of the autonomic nervous system. That's the only place where we use these terms. So if I say preganglionic neuron, postganglionic neuron, immediately in your head you start saying, right then, we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. That's what we're talking about, Kara. What do you want to know? Good? Okay. Where do we find the cell bodies? It is important for this unit, when you're learning about nerves, when you're learning about neurons, that you know where the somas are found. That you know what kind of fibers are in a nerve. Remember, some of them can be sensory only, some of them can be motor only, some can be mixed. Spinal nerves, they're all mixed. We have some fibers coming towards the spinal cord, afferent, sensory, and we have some outgoing commands, efferent. Right? So where are these cell bodies? Let's address that. First of all, and if you look at the pictures, first of all, the preganglionic cell body, if you look at my pictures, is always in the central nervous system. Always. That's where we find it. The postganglionic neuron, well, what is the definition of a ganglion? Collection of neuronal cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. Well, then that means the postganglionic cell bodies are going to be found in the ganglion, which means it's in the peripheral nervous system. It's not in the brain or spinal cord. It's not. Okay, so what should you know now? Preganglionic cell bodies are in the central nervous system. Postganglionic cell bodies are in the peripheral nervous system. The preganglionic and postganglionic neurons refer to visceral neurons. We don't have control over them. They're going to be talking to, communicating to involuntary effectors. For both divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, they use a 2-neuron chain. And for both of them, the first neuron always releases acetylcholine. Always. Always. Now, in physiology, we ask you to know the receptors that bind to neurotransmitters. It's important because drugs that we prescribe to patients target these receptors. So, I'm just going to put it up here, but it's not meant for you to know. The receptor on the postganglionic neuron is nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which is the same receptor that is most abundantly found on skeletal muscle. So this is a very common acetylcholine receptor, very common. Now where the two divisions start to be different, Where the two divisions start to differ is the neurotransmitter that the second neuron releases. So parasympathetic, I think, what are the first two vowels for the word parasympathetic? AA. So that means for parasympathetic, the first neuron releases acetylcholine, and the second one would also release acetylcholine. The word sympathetic, when we think of vowels, A, E, I, O, U, sometimes Y. Well, let's pretend Y is not a vowel. Let's pretend. What are the first two vowels then?
AE.
AE. So again, the first neuron will release acetylcholine, and the second one will typically release epinephrine or a version of epinephrine, like norepinephrine. Okay? Now, in physiology, you learn that there are very different outcomes for epinephrine, norepinephrine, and other examples of catecholamines like dopamine. This is not physiology, this is anatomy. So the first neuron releases acetylcholine for both divisions. The second neuron, it depends on which division we're playing with. Now the parasympathetic division is very simple. It's very simple. Sympathetic division is difficult. It has exceptions, quite a few exceptions. In physiology, these exceptions are dizzying. Which catecholamine are we talking about? Epinephrine or norepinephrine? In physiology, you learn about your catecholinergic, catecholamines and the adrenergic receptors. That's what I wanted to say. And there's alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. There's so many rules for the sympathetic. You're not there. What your job is to do is basically understand the mapping of these divisions. If we know the mapping, then when you get to phys, we can add layers to that.
A side topic on that double beta thing. Is that what beta blockers do? Is they block the postsynaptic?
Yep. They block the receptors on the involuntary effector.
Okay.
Someone who's taking a beta blocker like propanolol,
Yeah.
that specifically blocks sympathetic receptors on the heart.
Cool.
Yep.
Sorry, that's good.
And
So
you need that for, like, what is it? Why would you want to do that to the heart?
propanolol can be prescribed if someone has a high blood pressure or if their heart is working hard, like harder than it should. It also can be given to help reconstruct the heart in a more healthy way. So there are a myriad of reasons why someone could be on it. Maybe also they had dysrhythmia or something like that. They might be prescribed that. Okay, so now, next set. Where is the preganglionic cell body always found? In the CNS. Okay, now we need to get more specific. If I asked you where you live, you might give me a city. And then I would say, no, I want something more specific. You would then give me an address with a street address, wouldn't you? Okay. So it's general to say that the preganglionic neuron is in the CNS. Okay. Let's be specific. For which division are we speaking of? Where would we find these cell bodies specifically? If you are talking about the sympathetic division, those preganglionic cell bodies are found in the spinal cord at levels T1 through L2. That is where they're found. Specifically, in the spinal cord, there are certain areas where there is a lateral gray horn. So this is the dorsal gray horn. This is the ventral gray horn. Not dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal gray horn, ventral gray horn. And this area right here is a lateral gray horn. So, for the sympathetic preganglionic cell bodies, we would find them in the lateral gray horn at levels T1 through L2. That's where we would find it. Yeah.
So what does it mean by intermediate lateral cell column?
So, for anatomists, if I say lateral gray horn, anatomists would say to me, which one? Which one? If I were more specific, if I said intermediolateral cell column, then anyone who hears me say, oh, I'm talking about the IMLCC, then that person would say, oh, then we're talking about where I can find preganglionic cell bodies for this sympathetic division. That is a very specific address. It's a very specific term. So if I say IMLCC, immediately you should be thinking, right then, we're talking about sympathetic division. We're talking about preganglionic cell bodies at the levels of T1 through L2. That is what we're talking about. What do you want to know, Kara?
So that would be the street address.
Yeah, I'm very specific now. Okay? So now we're going to start drawing pathways. There has to be a way into the spinal cord for afferent signals. There has to be a way for outgoing signals, motor commands. It has to be. We're talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. We are currently focusing on their visceral motor commands, outgoing. In fact, on your exam, I don't ask you to draw visceral sensory incoming signals. I have to draw a line somewhere. It's enough that you know your motor outgoing. And those are things that we target a lot clinically. So that it's arbitrary why I go after them and not sensory. It is arbitrary. So these cell bodies have axons. Agreed? And the axons exit the spinal cord. The exit route is always the ventral rootlet. It's always the ventral rootlet leading to the ventral root. Always. Just like at a restaurant, there might be double swinging doors that are double hinged, and the wait staff know to use a certain door to enter the kitchen, and they know the other door is for exiting the kitchen. We enter through the dorsal root, we always exit through the ventral. Always. So, this preganglionic axon exits through a ventral root and will enter a spinal nerve. This whole area right here is a spinal nerve. If you remember when you were learning about your bones, when we had two vertebrae together, it created an intervertebral foramen. Do you remember that? And we had a model that showed yellow nerves exiting at every level of the spinal cord. out through that intervertebral foramen. So think of that intervertebral foramen right here. And that's now a spinal nerve. So this preganglionic axon exits through a ventral root, travels in a spinal nerve, and it's going to enter this structure called a sympathetic trunk. And these bulbous looking things are the sympathetic ganglia of the sympathetic trunk. That takes a long time to say. The sympathetic ganglia, the sympathetic trunk. It takes too long. So anatomists, of course, said, let's create another term to describe that. So if I use this other term, everyone will know I'm talking about the sympathetic ganglia, the sympathetic trunk. The other term for that is paravertebral ganglia. If I ever say paravertebral ganglia, it means ganglia that are next to the vertebrae. That's where you're going to find the sympathetic trunk and all the ganglia. And this goes the entire length of your spinal cord, the entire length of your vertebral column. Next week, when we open up the cats, it's not hard to see the sympathetic trunk and the sympathetic ganglia. These are macroscopic structures. You can see it, you could pick it up with your tweezer, and I think when you actually see these things, then it's not some abstract concept like, oh, Kara showed me this. I see what this looks like now. I understand her picture better now because I saw it in the cat.
Are they on the
They're on
anterior side or?
So they're all along your vertebrae, and they're on either side.
Okay,
So it looks like a ladder
lateral.
with rungs,
Okay.
is what it looks like. Okay? Paravertebral ganglia, immediately you're saying, oh, we're talking about the sympathetic system. What do you want to know? So this preganglionic fiber enters this structure that connects to the sympathetic trunk. That structure is called a white communicating ramus. White communicating ramus. This thing right here. See that structure right here that my pink axon went through? That is a white communicating ramus. The other one here is a gray communicating ramus. In your supplements, in your textbook, it talks about options that the first axon has. Options. Much like you going home today, aren't there options of which way you go home? Do you have more than one route that you could take? Okay, so this axon has options. It's got options. Which route will it take?
In this book, it says the white preread is
The white communicating ramus. Ramus is singular, rami is plural. No, that's okay. You're fine. So, one option is that the axon can enter this sympathetic trunk at level. So, for example, T1, the preganglionic fiber exits, enters a white ramus, goes to the sympathetic trunk at that level, and synapses, terminates. Synapse meaning it's going to release acetylcholine onto the next neuron. These are ganglia. What's the definition of a ganglion? A collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. This is outside the CNS. So option one is that axon can exit the spinal cord, enter the sympathetic trunk, and synapse at that level, like I've drawn. Okay? Another option is that it can travel up or down, and then synapse at a higher level or a lower. For example, do you have sweat glands in your face? Isn't your face, your head, you have sweat glands in your hair too. Isn't that above T1? Those are involuntary effectors. And your sweat glands are under control of the sympathetic division. So if I want to target any involuntary effector that is higher than T1 or lower than L2, I need to provide that option. Are you seeing that? Okay. White communicating rami are only found where you find the preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies. Where do we find sympathetic preganglionic cell bodies? In the IMLCC of T1 through L2. Those levels will be the only place you see a white ramus, an indoor into the sympathetic trunk.
Are those distinguishable with cats?
Not easily, but on humans, yes.
So is it white because it looks white versus gray?
It's white because it's myelinated, and the gray is not. The white is always more lateral, which is weird because a lot of students go, well, that's the indoor. You'd think that'd be closer to where the cell body was. Nope, not. It actually overshoots. Weird. But you always have to have a mode of egress. You always have to have an exit route. So gray communicating rami are found all along the spinal cord, all levels. Gray is always present. White, you would only find white at T1 through L2. That is the only place to find an entrance to the sympathetic trunk. Once you're in the sympathetic trunk, you can synapse at that level, or you can go up higher or down lower. Those are the options. Synapse at level, go higher in synapse, go lower in synapse. Okay? So in the supplements, if you're reading the ANS supplement, it will give you options. And also in the lecture, you'll see me show you options for the preganglionic fiber and postganglionic fiber for both divisions. So right now, again, we're doing the sympathetic division. We're tackling the options for the sympathetic preganglionic fiber. Are you okay? Good? Okay. Now, what can the postganglionic neuron do? It also has options. There are different ways for it to exit. Different ways to exit. If the postganglionic neuron axon exits through a gray ramus, it can re-enter a spinal nerve. This is an anterior primary ramus. And this back here that I've cut off is a posterior primary ramus. Ramus means branch. Primary, first branches off the spinal nerve. That sounds pretty. So the postganglionic fiber can exit through a gray ramus and go to a spinal nerve. Either go to the front of your body through an anterior primary ramus, or to the back of your body through a posterior primary ramus. Don't you have glands in your skin that are sweat glands? I have sweat glands here on the anterior side of my body. I have sweat glands back here on my back as well. Most things are going to enter an anterior primary ramus because where do you have your spinal cord? Back here. Most everything else is anterior of it, isn't it? So an anterior primary ramus is much larger than a posterior. You just don't need the volume because there's not much to get behind the spinal cord. You okay? I just vomited a whole bunch of information on you, and I'm just getting started, which should make you very happy that you were here today. Okay, so preganglionic fiber in pink. What are the options? It can go 2-level and synapse. It can go up higher and synapse. It can go lower and synapse. Okay. There is going to be another option, a very exceptional option, but I'm going to do that at the end. So there is another option for the preganglionic fiber. Again, the sympathetic division is more challenging because of all these options. It's a lot. Postganglionic neuron has options. It can go through a gray communicating ramus and enter a spinal nerve to get to things in your body wall. That means structures of your skin. What structures, what involuntary effectors do you have in your skin? You have smooth muscle, you have glands, and you definitely have fat. It's in the dermis, right? Which is just, it's in the hypodermis, and the hypodermis is technically not considered part of your integument system, but because of its proximity, we learn about it at that time. So these are the involuntary effectors we have in our body wall. And I'm not saying that's the only place you find these involuntary effectors. Clearly, we have smooth muscle in your intestines. Clearly, we have fat around our intestines. Clearly, we have other glands in our body that are different from sweat glands. Okay, so again, these involuntary effectors are found in your body wall. And if I was targeting those involuntary effectors, the postganglionic fiber would exit through a gray ramus, enter a spinal nerve, and then go to the skin, the body wall, to get to those involuntary effectors. Option number 2 for the postganglionic sympathetic fibers. Option number 2, I'm drawing a line here to represent the diaphragm. There are involuntary effectors above the diaphragm in your thoracic cavity. What are they? It's heart and your lungs. The lungs look like domed pyramids to me. So one option for the postganglionic fiber is to want to go internally, not to the body wall. So if it's trying to get internally to something above the diaphragm, that postganglionic neuron can just break through the sympathetic trunk and go to those involuntary effectors in your thoracic cage. That is an option for it.
So it doesn't need a duct or an opening?
Just grows the nerve right out through the back.
Is there an example of one?
Is that an example of one right there?
That is it.
Oh.
If I'm going to the heart or the lungs, if I'm running for my life, don't I want my heart rate and force of contraction to go up? Wouldn't that be when the sympathetic division is more in control? If I'm running for my life, don't I want smooth muscle in my lungs to relax so I have bigger bronchioles to allow for more air? If you're running for your life, you're sucking wind. You know what I mean by that, right? And you want big air passageways. You don't want constricted. Now, what about below the diaphragm? So, Lisa, do you see how this nerve is kind of just growing out from the back? Okay, I could have drawn it, this axon coming through there and going to the heart or lungs. Below the diaphragm, the axon below the diaphragm we start to see one of our exceptions. Below the diaphragm, no, I'm going back to pink, because it's the preganglionic fiber. Below the diaphragm, the preganglionic fiber doesn't have to go and synapse in the sympathetic trunk. It can synapse in a different ganglion. These ganglia below the diaphragm are found on major blood vessels in your abdominal cavity. These major blood vessels are vessels you will dissect next week. One of these major vessels coming off the aorta is called the Celiac Artery, which actually means that it's going to the stomach. So sitting on top of the celiac artery is the celiac ganglion. It sits right on top of the artery. You can see it. Next week we'll dissect it. You can pick up that ganglion. You can pick up that ganglion with your tweezers. Again, I think it's helpful to then take the picture and then see, visualize on the cat. It's very helpful. These things exist. We can see them. Another artery coming off of the aorta is the superior mesenteric artery. that name tells you it's going to most of your intestines. And sitting on top of that artery is another white, bulbous looking thing called a ganglion. You can see it. Another artery coming off the aorta is called the inferior mesenteric artery, and it's going to lower parts of your intestines. And again, sitting on top of it is a ganglion called the inferior mesenteric ganglion. So these ganglia have specific names. Celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, inferior mesenteric ganglion. Very specific names. This structure here, a ganglion that a preganglionic fiber goes through to reach, has another name. It takes too long, Lisa, for me to say ganglia below the diaphragm that aren't part of the sympathetic trunk. That takes too long. If I say collateral ganglion, if I say collateral ganglion, and there's still another term for it, prevertebral, if I say collateral ganglion or prevertebral ganglion, you, with enough studying, should say to yourself, right then, I'm talking about sympathetic ganglia below the diaphragm that sit on top of major blood vessels in the abdominal cavity. That is what Kara's talking about, specifically for the sympathetic division. Then, from there, we would have a postganglionic neuron that will go to involuntary effectors in your gut, like smooth muscle, adipose tissue, glands of the digestive tract, but not the heart. It's not going to the heart. The heart is above the diaphragm, not below. Okay? Okay. So options. Preganglionic fiber can enter a sympathetic trunk and terminate synapse at level. It can go up. It can go down. It can go below the diaphragm and go to a different ganglion on major blood vessels. The last exception, the last option for the preganglionic axon, the last one, is the following, and I'm going to draw it in a different color. Exits through a ventral root, enters the spinal nerve, goes below the diaphragm, but did not go to this ganglion. This is going to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is the middle part of your adrenal glands. This is where most of the epinephrine is released when you're having a fight or flight response. This is why we say I'm having an adrenaline rush. Does that make sense? So this will terminate on the adrenal medulla. I'm just going to put AM. And students say, Kara, you're breaking a rule. That's one neuron going to a gland. Where's the 2-neuron rule? It should be 2 neurons. I'm not seeing it. It's going straight to an involuntary effector. And the adrenal medulla is such a unique exception because the adrenal medulla is the second neuron.
So that's pretty much the postganglionic.
It is the postganglionic neuron. in this gland, just a whole bunch of them collected. And that's why we get such a huge amount of epinephrine released from our adrenal glands. In your homework packet, I'm going to erase this, and we're going to tackle this problem in your homework packet. And then I'm going to go to the parasympathetic division. And we'll talk about the circuitry for the parasympathetic division and what options it has. There are fewer. It's a much more simple nervous system. Huh? Yeah. You're not buying it for $1 though, I could tell. You're like, none of this is simple. It's all tedious and difficult. You're right. You're right, which is why I offered to be here today. No, thank you for showing up.
Yeah.
It's all in the video, but I think it's helpful to actually start drawing this. Back when I taught a traditional face-to-face, we would spend an entire day, lecture and lab, and we'd have a potluck. And we were doing these drawings all day long. All day long. So I'm going to do this problem. I'm going to erase everything. And when we're done with the problem, we'll have a short break so I can check on my sweet phys student, and then we'll move to the parasympathetic division. And that will be it for today. It's enough. It's enough. What?
Did I just answer that already by doing that?
I can't. Well,
mean,
maybe.
I just.
We'll see if you're right. How about that, Dom? We'll find
Right,
out if
you're
what
right.
you drew is correct.
Okay.
So I'm going to erase everything. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Again, with this picture, we can only use this picture for the sympathetic division. These structures here are sympathetic structures. Nothing parasympathetic goes through them. None whatsoever. So the question in the homework packet says, it represents a cross-section of the spinal cord corresponding to the level of T2. Is the T2 level a place where we find sympathetic structures?
Yes.
Isn't that where we find the preganglionic cell bodies, T1 through L2? So right there, I'm telling you what level you're at, T2, and this is a possible place for me to be thinking sympathetic. Okay? It says draw an A on the central canal. Okay. The central canal would be right here, where cerebral spinal fluid would be traveling through. So you would mark an A. This is where you start getting points simply for knowing the anatomy of the spinal cord. The next problem says, draw a B where preganglionic cell bodies would be found. Wouldn't they be found in a lateral gray horn, specifically the IMLCC? Okay. Then it says, draw an arrow to the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. You have different types of ganglia. Not all of them are autonomic. The dorsal root ganglion is this one. And that's where sensory cell bodies are found. All sensory cell bodies are found in ganglia. All of them are. They're in dorsal root ganglia for the spinal cord. Draw the afferent nerve that detects changes in blood pressure. Make sure you name this nerve and correctly draw its origin and where it terminates. Okay. Well, if I'm detecting blood pressure and I'm in the heart, it's baroreceptors that are in the aortic arch and carotid sinus. Carotid sinus is not shown here, but the aortic arch is. So the afferent fiber that comes off of these baroreceptors is actually cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. And if you look at your notes from last week, I told you the vagus nerve was a mixed nerve. It had sensory and motor components. Remember, some say marry money, but my brother says big boobs matter most. Remember that? Or big brains? So it would go up to the brain. Here, I'm going to draw it again. It would go up to the brain and synapse. Specifically, it would synapse in the medulla oblongata. That's the part of the brain that wants to get feedback about what the heart is doing. How fast is your heart rate? How hard is your heart beating? Okay? So this is sensory incoming. Okay. Then the next part of the problem says, make sure you name this nerve and correctly draw its origin and where it terminates, okay? Well, I've drawn its origin. That's where the cell bodies are, well, that's where the baroreceptors are found. That's where this nerve begins. The cell bodies are actually in ganglia. So I'm going to just draw this little structure as the cell body for cranial nerve 10. And it terminates on the medulla oblongata. That's where integration is occurring. It is the medulla oblongata's job to get this information and then make an appropriate output command. Is the heart not working as hard as it should? Is it working too hard? I need that information. The next question says, draw the two neuron chain that would speed up heart rate. Okay. So cranial nerve 10 is sending information to the medulla oblongata. And for this next problem, it says, draw the two neuron chain that would speed up heart rate. Well, which division is that? It's sympathetic. Is your heart above your diaphragm? Okay. So, remember, we're at level of T2.
It's gonna go up.
It's going to go through the ventral root, enter a white ramus, and it's going to go, is it going to go out below the diaphragm?
It's gonna make its own.
Will it go out to the adrenal glands? No. It's not going to go out to the body wall.
It makes its own to the heart.
So it's gonna terminate here at level. Now it's the postganglionic neuron that's going to break out and go to the heart to speed up heart rate. That is a craptacular pen, isn't it?
On to the SA.
SA node, AV node, even the ventricles. Then the last problem says, write the neurotransmitters used by each neuron in that previous question. Well, for sympathetic, the first neuron releases acetylcholine. What does the second neuron release?
Acetylcholine.
Not from the second.
Oh,
Remember,
for the other one?
A-E-I-O-U, sometimes Y, and the word sympathetic is
Epinephrine.
epinephrine. Your adrenergic response, your adrenaline rush, the beating, pounding heart. Okay? You will be asked to draw these reflex arcs. You should know how to draw the reflex arc for increasing heart rate, decreasing heart rate. Decreasing heart rate is parasympathetic. We'll get there. We're doing everything sympathetic right now. Increasing gut motility, if you're running for your life, is that an appropriate time to have to go big potty?
No.
So increased gut motility will be parasympathetic. Decreased gut motility is sympathetic.
Because you don't want them to go potty while you're running.
Correct. I want my students to be able to draw the options for increasing heart rate, decreasing heart rate, increasing gut motility, decreasing gut motility, and then also knowing the options to get to the body wall. Remember, go up, go down, but you're exiting through the gray ramus. So go have a break, and when you come back, we'll do parasympathetic. What's up, Don?
But for the, when it goes to the medulla from the heart, do we have to know
Goes to
that
the
it goes-
medulla from the heart.
Part of the medulla.
I mean the heart to the medulla. So that, does it get to know like if
Medulla oblongata.
Yeah, so you have the
Okay.
medulla.
Okay.
Do you need to know that it goes from like those three centers, like the ventral thing? No?
You're talking about the pyramids?
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. This is hard enough.
Yeah.
The circuitry is important because when you get to phys, as she can tell you, knowing the circuitry makes memorizing the drugs and the receptors less tedious because you already know how things are. You already know those reflex arcs. You know the wiring of the body. Now you can apply the drugs there. So have a break, and when you come back, I'll have everything ready for parasympathetic, okay? And that's a different picture we're going to use.